ahead.
Do any other countries have anything similar to Fannie and Freddie, and where does America rank in the world in terms of home ownership?
Other countries do not have anything similar to Fannie and Freddie, and America, I think, is solidly in the middle of the pack in terms of home ownership. I don't think our home ownership rates are particularly exceptional compared to other countries, and that's always been an argument. Well, then why can't we do it the way other countries do? I would add, and that's totally legitimate. I would add two thoughts to that. One is that other countries aren't like the U.S. We're a very diverse nation, both geographically speaking and sort of size-wise, and our banking system is very different from other countries' banking systems. So other countries, sort of dates back to the Alexander Hamilton days. There was always a debate about the Bank of the United States. So other countries kind of have their big national banks that then finance home ownership, which leads to my last point. People pretend that's the free market, but if you look around the world, Europe had to bail all of its banks out in the financial crisis too. Why? Because they supported home ownership. So I'm not really sure that this apparent dichotomy of government-sponsored enterprises and free market is as clear as it might seem on the surface.
Yeah, it seems like you have two arguments: either give it to Fannie and Freddie or give it to the TBTF.
Right.
What about the It's a Wonderful Life? Where it all should have failed. All those entities, acronyms,
Right.
failed in a way, and a little, something would pop up.
I have a lot of sympathy for that argument. I'm just not sure we can turn the clock back. I kind of wish we could turn the clock back, but I think the reality is that if you get rid of Fannie and Freddie, the mortgage market goes to the big banks. I don't think we're going to sort of in one fell swoop get rid of Fannie and Freddie and break up the big banks. That might be the right answer. I'm not in a lot of ways, but I don't think it's going to happen. So I'm trying to inject a dose of pragmatism into the debate.
So are you admitting that is the most logical and ethical outcome? I'm saying that.
I'm not positive about that. I think I'd have to think about it a lot more. It is the one that is sort of the most ideologically appealing to me, but I think there are sort of legitimate arguments against having a fractured small banking system in a modern world. So the short answer is I think I'd really need to think about it before I'd say that. My instinctive answer is that it appeals to me.
Long experience of researching this area of the economy. What's your opinion? Which part of the housing industrial complex are most important or most powerful to influence on politicians, and what's the relationship within this complex? Do all these participants feel that they are in one boat and teaming up together, or are they also fighting?
It's a great question. It would actually be really fascinating. Somebody should do a diagram of the housing industrial complex and the sort of alliances of convenience and the wars between them, because no, they don't all want the same thing. One of the big things getting in the way of GSE reform is the fight between big lenders and small lenders, because the nation's small banks are very worried that if the big banks were to get control of the market, they would be done for. And they view the GSEs as their salvation, sort of their only lifeline to being able to compete in this market. The mortgage insurers have always they only exist because of Fannie and Freddie. They came into life because Fannie and Freddie aren't allowed to take credit risk above a certain loan to value. So the mortgage industry, the mortgage insurers are sort of like parasites on Fannie and Freddie. They exist because of them, because they have a love-hate relationship with Fannie and Freddie, and they have their own clout. They're the realtors, they're the home builders, there's the Mortgage Bankers Association, which tends to be more aligned with the big banks in the view of the market. So it's actually a very fractured, fractured set of interests, I would say. But all at their core still have this idea that homeownership is in their financial interest. We'll make it more grander than that. We'll say that homeownership is good for the nation. Go ahead.
If the plaintiffs prevail and deal with the federal court away from the Delaware courts,
Yep.
Would that change the political calculus, and would it mean that HOA would still be in charge of the conservatorship?
Right. Well, I think, and maybe somebody in this room will be able to contradict me, I think we don't really know what would happen if the plaintiffs in the lawsuits prevail. We don't really know what the remedy would be, but I think that's actually a real risk. I think that one of the big risks here is that the government, the citizens, lose control of this debate, whether because of a court ruling or because of extraneous events like a shock in interest rates to Fannie and Freddie's bottom line that causes big losses at the companies. And suddenly, instead of being thoughtful about this, the matters are going to sort of burst out beyond our control. And I worry about that. I am intellectually on the side of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, but I worry about what a victory would actually mean in terms of reform.
And if they lose and they're in your system, one of the arguments I've heard is that the American system allows a 30-year fixed mortgage, whereas most
Countries don't.
systems that are not like this kind of controlled, kind of implicit,
Right.
huge market do not have a 30-year.
Right. I think it would if the plaintiffs lose. It's sort of a Pyrrhic victory in a way because it doesn't do anything to answer the question of what do we do with Fannie and Freddie. It just means the investors don't get paid. But it would be a Pyrrhic victory for the government because it'd still have this festering problem on their hands. And that is something, there is this belief that without the presence of Fannie and Freddie in the market, you would not have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. And certainly that instrument is unique to America. In other places that don't have Fannies and Freddies, you do not have that instrument available. Then you can get into a long debate, well, should we have 30-year fixed rate mortgages? But I think I saw some data from the Urban Institute about a month last fall, something, where 88% of the borrowers who got a mortgage took out a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So if you tell Americans they can't have this thing anymore, I think you've got a bit of a political mess on your hands, whether we should or shouldn't have it anymore. So you mean?
What do other countries do? How do they have?
So they have different systems. The best known one in Europe is that mortgages are financed by what are known as covered bonds, where a bank issues bonds that are specifically backed by homeowners' mortgage payments, much like Fannie and Freddie's bonds are, but the bank stands behind those payments. And so you can argue that's a free market. That's a bank financing mortgages. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, European countries had to bail out their banks in the financial crisis too. I'm not really sure that many people would call Europe's big banks sort of totally free market enterprises. In Canada, there are two large national banks that finance the mortgage market thus far. That's been pretty healthy. I think the Canadian mortgage market has been overheating recently, and we'll see how that one ends. So it's generally either the banking system or our system of Fannie and Freddie. There are probably some alternatives out there, but they're not coming to mind right now. Back there.
One thing I didn't notice in your book, by the way, it's wonderful, everybody.
Thank you.
One thing I didn't notice in your book, and Dick Mulvaney points out, that without a 30-year mortgage, the home values across the board are going to drop
Right.
significantly.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
I never like agreeing with things that are future events. You know what I mean? I don't think we really know. I think it would depend a lot on what's going on elsewhere in the economy. I think if the 30-year fixed rate mortgage had gone away in the run-up to the credit crisis, I don't know how big an impact it would have had, right? And you could argue that if home prices fell dramatically, that would be better because homes would be more affordable for people. I think it would be a nasty economic shock that our economy can't take. And I tend to believe if they weren't available, that it would lead to some sort of downward pressure on home prices. That makes intellectual sense to me. But again, I've never sort of dug through the numbers and to be absolutely comfortable about that. But Dick knows a lot, so
But it makes some sense.
it may totally make sense.
If all of a sudden, you've got a 5 or 10, 15-year mortgage and your
Right.
payment is, $400 more.
Right. It makes
Obviously, you can't buy the same one.
it makes total sense. It makes total sense. David?
And what have your sources told you about the revival of the private lending securities market?
So I think the fact that Wall Street, that private money has not come back into the mortgage business, and it has not. And I'm going to answer this question in a bit of a roundabout way, because one thing economists and academics will often tell me is, well, there are all these studies in the 1990s that Fannie and Freddie don't really provide any value. They don't reduce average mortgage rates. And I always say, how can you still be talking about that? After the financial crisis, it's very clear there would not have been a mortgage market but for Fannie and Freddie. So how can you say they don't provide any value? Private capital has deserted the mortgage market. There's been less than, I think, 10 billion of private label securities sold since the financial crisis, and that's with pristine credit associated with these securities. And whenever the market has wobbled, the securities has been unsaleable, even though the credit of the underlying mortgages is pristine. I think there are a lot of causes. There are a lot of reasons why that's happened. I don't think it's solely private capital not wanting anything to do with the mortgage market, although I think that's part of it. But there's a lot else going on with the market. The government has been a little bit schizophrenic about whether or not they want private capital back in the market. I mean, they say that. President Obama has said we want private capital to finance our mortgage market. We don't want Fannie and Freddie. They need to be abolished. But then they hit the big banks with fines for everything they possibly can and stepping outside the lines on something. And I'm not saying the banks don't deserve to be fined, but you kind of can't have it both ways. You can't be saying we want private capital back in the mortgage market and then saying, thwack, kill the private capital. And by the way, GSE investors who are private capital, we're going to make sure you don't get a dime on your investment. I mean, it's a little bit of a schizophrenic response, I think.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on Fannie Mae basically setting the underwriting standards for mortgages across the market, and
Yep.
how, whatever they do, everyone kind of gets in mind, and how that might affect the overall economy.
Yep.
Or underwriting, risk in general for borrowers. And then second, do you have any thoughts on FHA?
So I think that Fannie in the 1990s did dictate a lot of the terms on which mortgages were made across the country. I don't believe the argument that the weakening of standards at Fannie and Freddie is what led to the subprime crisis, because you can trace a whole separate rise of the subprime mortgage industry in the 1990s. And arguably what happened in the crisis, Fannie and Freddie's market share began to plunge just as the crisis got worse. Arguably they lost control of the market after their accounting scandals, and as they lost control of the market, that's when the problems when the problems really hit. But now I think they do, to some extent, control or underwriting standards across the country. There are some other things going on that make things that play into that, but Fannie and Freddie play a large role in that. And that to me is one reason why I'm still enough of a capitalist free market type that having the companies that control mortgage credit under the thumb of the government is not a happy thing to me. I don't like the idea of politicians being able to say, let's move the needle on the economy by lowering the standards for mortgage risk, by ratcheting up the standards for mortgage risk, by the administration that happens to be in control being able to have their thumb on that lever. I think that's a pretty dangerous thing. So when people say, why don't we just nationalize them and be done with it, I can't quite subscribe to that. And interestingly enough, on the subject of FHA, someone who is very senior made that argument to me. She said, I might once have said that we should just put this all in the government, but then I worked at FHA. And she said, you do not want this enormous market where they're very sophisticated Wall Street firms and traders being run by a government agency. You want there to be an ability to be fast moving and innovative and to respond to things going on in this very complicated, fast-moving market. So I don't really believe that the FHA is sort of this panacea or this model that Fannie and Freddie should follow.
How does the commercial mortgage market work?
You're getting a little bit beyond my knowledge base here, but I believe that is financed much more by private money, by the big banks often, and by investors. But for some reason, commercial mortgage risk has always been different than individual homeowner risk. And I think part of that is that a lot of big investors are not equipped to do the work on a package of 100,000 mortgages and figure out whether they want the credit risk or not, whereas a package of portfolio that's backed by, say, 10 properties, I can model that, right? So I think that's part of the reason. It's the discrete nature of homeowner risk versus the more easy to model, potentially scarier, but easier to model commercial real estate risk. So I think I'm not sure that a model that works for one would work for the other.
What do you think would be a couple of scenarios for catalysts that would actually cause some kind of reform in the system that would bring us to a moment where we could see a breakout?
What I worry about is that it will be a catalyst, that it won't be a well thought out plan either to transition Fannie and Freddie, some idea that hasn't come to light yet to replace them with something that makes more sense. I worry that it will be a catalyst, that it will be a big loss caused by interest rate movements and their need to draw from the taxpayers again. I worry that it will be a victory in the shareholder lawsuits that then will have the government sort of having its hands tied, and you know, suddenly we owe the investors $200 billion. I'm not saying that's going to be the number, but you know, I worry that a catalyst won't be a good thing. You know, we've kind of squandered this opportunity. Someone senior in the administration called it the greatest example of political dysfunction he's ever seen, that we've been sort of unable to do anything about Fannie and Freddie for 7 years.
I realize this is, you were looking at Fannie and Freddie and not the other GSEs.
Right.
But just from this, do you have concerns about other GSEs and the GSE structure in general?
Well, I don't, you know, I have evolved on the GSE in general structure. I'm not really sure in the end there's a way to do it better, and that's what I meant by ending with this Churchill quote. For all that Fannie and Freddie's dual public-private nature seems Frankensteinish and completely conflicted, I'm not sure you want it to be any different. I have a hard time coming up with a system that I think works better. I think if we were to bring Fannie and Freddie back to life, you would want them to be heavily reformed. You would want them to operate as utilities. You would want them to have some sort of counter-cyclical measure built in, so when the housing market was going crazy, they pulled back from the housing market. I'm not suggesting we bring Fannie and Freddie back to life as they were, but I'm not sure that this GSE structure is inherently as awful as it seems once you start to look at the alternatives.
And then the conservatorship, sort of, what do you anticipate going forward?
More of the same? Nothing? There's total political stalemate in Washington. Representative Mulvaney, a Republican, has actually proposed a bill that would allow the GSEs to start building capital again so that they could weather a downturn. And it's really interesting, I think, for a Republican to propose this bill, because the most prominent Republican bill thus far has been a bill by Jeb Hensarling that would totally eradicate Fannie and Freddie and get the government out of the market altogether. So there's stalemate.
You allude to a really weird thing when Raines and Howard settled the $31 million.
Yeah.
They're allowed to use the strike price of the option to calculate that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, was there anything, that's just like a charade?
I think it was Tim Howard who said this to me, and I think I quoted him publicly, so I think it's okay to say this, but he said a fraudulent allegation, it's fitting that a fraudulent allegation of accounting fraud ended with a fraudulent settlement. Yeah. So.
I read that. I was kind of fascinated. Could you explain a little more detail what he was saying?
So basically, when
paid 31 million.
So nobody, when Frank Raines, I don't remember the exact numbers, but when Frank Raines and Tim Howard both paid money to their regulator to settle the allegations of accounting fraud against them, they essentially used fake money. The regulator calculated their options at their highest value, that when the stock price was at its height, and used that value to say this is what they're paying, when in reality Frank Raines and Tim Howard gave up options that had no value anymore because the stock had declined. Yeah.
I read that. Started scratching.
No, it's really crazy, right? I mean, when have you ever had, back to my line, when have you ever had a regulator call their regulated company Enron and then have it end like this?
And then have the media keep repeating that they paid $31 million.
Right.
You're saying they didn't pay anything.
They paid a little bit, but a tiny little bit. It was not. I mean, I think it was some of it was covered by insurance. I think the out-of-pocket money, I had calculated it once. I don't remember the numbers, but the out-of-pocket money was like next to nothing.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Strange story, right? I don't think there's ever been anything like this in American business. So go ahead, yeah.
Aside from your article back in 2005, were there any other people who saw this coming, especially journalists? And if so, what percentage was affected?
You know, I think all of us, me included, the Wall Street Journal did a lot of criticism of Fannie and Freddie in the run-up to the crisis, but they were wrong. The big criticism of Fannie and Freddie was that they had interest rate risk, and that was going to bring them down and bring down the economy. Everybody missed the credit risk. So people said these two companies are dangerous, but they missed the underlying cause of the problem, and then they totally missed the concurrent problems in the private market in the Wall Street financed and backed loans. So I think it's really hard for anybody to say they called it, and I think it's really hard for anybody to say they called it with any degree of intellectual honesty.
Should journalists have done a better job?
I think we all should have done a better job in the run-up to the financial crisis, but I'm going to caveat that by saying I think journalists did a really great job of covering the bubble in home prices. That was constantly written about. What we failed to do was to say the bubble in home prices was going to translate to, because these loans were being packaged and sold by firms, it was going to translate into problems in the banking system. I'm not sure that was predictable in advance. It would have been a leap before it happened, I think. I mean, I wrote a piece in Fortune about the problems with the rating agency way of rating bonds in like early 2007, but even then I wouldn't have seen that it would have caused all these broader problems in the economy. So I think it's more a failure of imagination than a failure of reporting, or a failure of an analytical leap. Let's call it. Imagination is giving us too much pass, but I'd call it a failure of an analytical leap.
But in your defense, in journalist defense, nobody really knew the extent of the exposure because
Right.
of the synthetic products that had been invented.
That's true.
to mimic housing prices.
Right. But if anybody had sort of understood, I don't think any of us really understood the machinery of turning home loans into securities and how crazy it had gotten and what the ripple effects through the banking system could be. But again, that understanding wasn't there to be had and then ignored by the press. It just wasn't there. Nobody had it. So again, I call it sort of a failure of an analytical leap rather than kind of a real reporting failure. Make sense?
You have one more question?
They do. It's true. Thank you all so much. Thanks for your interest.
Bethany would be happy to sign a book if you purchase over there. That story is on page 91 about Mr. Howard, and all the other stories are fascinating, on sale now. Go get a copy. Thank you.